style and his own approach and his own lessons. So I'm not going to in any way disrupt what he has going on with the 12 apostles. But we are going to study tonight another topic, and I'll go through that here in just a moment. But before I do, I just want to make mention of a prayer request. We actually found out today that my aunt, who lives actually in Ackworth, fell off a ladder at her daughter's house and son-in-law's house. They weren't there. She fell off a ladder, fell onto the cement, broke her femur, and we don't know exactly how she got to the hospital, but we're finding out some more information, and apparently she was supposed to have some kind of emergency surgery today. But they live again in Ackworth, and we'll figure out exactly what's going on with that situation. But it was hard to hear, and no one was around as far as we know. So I'm not sure exactly how she got cared for and attended to. She does have an Apple Watch. I thought maybe because it can detect falls, maybe something like that was what triggered the emergency services to come out. But I don't know. We still haven't found out. Anyway, yes, brother. Okay. And this wasn't planned, you said? You're not sure yet. Okay. 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 All right. So let's keep Laverne then in our prayers, and Cheryl as well, and we will stay on top of that and see what's going on. All righty. So tonight we're gonna study the topic of something I've been learning about as I watch basketball. So we have the playoff season is well and live, and we're watching some teams go back and forth, and I don't know really much about anything on basketball, and so it's very, very interesting to watch it from that perspective, and certainly it is an interesting game, and a game that I really don't know a whole lot about, and so as I watch and as I listen to these analysts, they review the game and they go through various plays and why things work, why things don't work. And a lot of times it boils down to really three major aspects, two of which you're probably very familiar with, that I also was very, very familiar with. And that is offense and defense. It's two of the three. And if they aren't holding on to the ball appropriately and are not passing it accurately and successfully, then they have offensive problems. If they're not shooting it well, then they have offensive problems. They're not scoring points. And guess what? If they're not guarding their players correctly and they're not blocking shots and they're not causing disruption in the paint, I've learned that phrase, as the opposing team charges the basket and tries to make a shot, then they're going to have defensive problems. And there's going to be a lot of points racked up against them. But then there's another aspect to basketball, which is the aspect of the transition. So this is the one that I've really started to focus in on, and I've heard these analysts bring it up more and more as the playoff season unfolds, where the teams that tend to fail because they fall apart in the transition. What is the transition? The transition is where they are moving from that offensive posture all of a sudden to a defensive posture. They've missed a shot. They've gotten the ball stolen, and now the other team is on offense, and they have transitioned to defense, and the ball is moving down the court. And it can be looked at from both perspectives, both the offensive perspective, transitioning to the defensive perspective, and the other way around. And that's a huge aspect of the game. And if you think about just the general idea of transitions are hard, are they not? They're very difficult to manage. Why is it difficult to manage transitions? And what are some examples of transitions that we would maybe find ourselves in throughout life? People don't like change, and they don't want to change, right? So you're in the midst of a transition, maybe not one that you have provoked or brought upon yourself, one that you are having to go through because of biological fact, right? You grow older. One you're having to go through because of your economic status. One you're having to go through because of familial status. Whatever it may be, it's a change. It's a disruption to what you're used to. So you don't like that very much. What are some other examples that might exist of transition? Or why are they hard? Jobs, just changing jobs, right? May even be in the same field, the same type of work, but you're dealing with a different company, you're dealing with a different culture, you're dealing with different coworkers, a different boss, different pay potentially, a different feel, and all of that can be hard. So what are we studying this week? We're studying comforting one another and the blessings of comfort. And I want you to think about what God tells us about transitions and just the comfort that exists in the fact that he knows we go through transitions. Isn't that comforting in and of itself right away? Hey, our Creator knows we're going to go through these transitions in life. He knows that we're going to experience ups and downs. He knows we're going to experience change. And he's communicated that reality to us. So let's go ahead and turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We have some in our household who will be transitioning here in just over a year into middle school, at which point we will then have 3 middle schoolers under our roof. We just had one this year who transitioned into kindergarten. You can go through life feeling like you're still transitioning to marriage. Hannah and I say we're newlyweds for life, and we don't mean that on a negative perspective, but sometimes it can feel that way as well. You're getting used to the fact that, hey, you're bound to this other person. That's a transition. You can go through a transition because you're graduating high school. What are you going to do after high school? You might be going through a transition because, hey, I've got a new health situation in my life that now I have to figure out how to deal with. It changes my routine. It changes everything about my life. And so let's look here at Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And if someone wants to read for me there, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, the first 8 verses. All right, thank you, brother, so much. So I remember this context being eye-opening for me, especially when you look there at the end of verse 7. Yes, there are times when it is appropriate to be silent and not just speak, right? There are times when it is appropriate to act in certain ways and times when it is appropriate to refrain from acting in certain ways. There's transitions, there's, quote, seasons that we go through in life. Oftentimes this passage will be used, especially, for example, on ladies' days, where seasons of life are studied and kind of dove into in great detail, or ladies' weeks, for example. But it doesn't just apply to ladies' weeks and ladies' days and ladies' retreats. It's applicable to all of us. And it's a comfort just to know and remember that God is aware of the fact and tells us of the fact that we're going to go through transitions. Just that alone is comforting. Hey, my routine in my life is going to change, and that's normal. That's a part of life, okay? Let's think about this, though. How can we manage these transitions faithfully? In other words, as we go through the temptation of feeling disrupted and feeling anxious and feeling uncomfortable and out of place, we might be tempted to let go of our faith or let loose and fall back or drift slowly but surely. What's the stat that we often refer to? Young people who leave the home. They've attended services their whole life, and then all of a sudden they leave home. What happens? Why? Routine changed, life changed, mom and dad aren't there anymore, changed. All these things change. What happened when they went through those changes? They obviously made certain decisions, compromises, gives and takes on their faith. And so how can the transitions of life be managed faithfully? I want you to think about, for just a moment, as we contemplate that question, a quote. And I want you to hear this quote from someone who in no way do I recommend his lifestyle or his overall ideology, but he's a well-known business titan, and he's built something that probably all of us use frequently in some way or another, Amazon. And that's Jeff Bezos, who's been asked throughout his life to basically tell people what the next 10 years will look like when you think about the future and you think about technology. And he says, hey, I've been asked this all the time. What's going to change in the next 10 years? And that is a very interesting question, he says. It's a very common one. I almost never get the question, what's not going to change in the next 10 years? Right? Why would anyone ask him that question? But then he goes on and says, and I submit to you that second question is actually the more important of the two. Because you can build a business strategy around the things that are stable in our time. In our retail business, we know that customers want low prices. And I know that's going to be true 10 years from now. They want fast delivery. They want vast selection. It's impossible to imagine a future 10 years from now where a customer comes up and says, Jeff, I love Amazon. I just wish the prices were a little higher. Or, I love Amazon. I just wish you deliver a little more slowly. Impossible, he says. So what's his recommendation? When you think about the changes of the business world, you think about the changes of society and technology and the future and what all the future is going to behold. He says, don't focus on what all can change. Focus on what you know won't change. Well, think about that as we contemplate our own life's transitions. As we go through ebbs and flows, as we go through various seasons, as we go through changing relationships, changing circumstances, rather than allowing ourselves to get all caught up on what's changed or what's going to change or what we want to change, what if we fixated on what we know will never change and what we know we should focus on, what we can control, that should never change? What if that's the way we attacked it? I want you to contemplate that tonight. And let's think, of course, of that song that we sing, Hold to God's Unchanging Hand. And as the Hebrews writer writes in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 8, says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today and forever. There are things in this life that are eternal. Eternal truths that we can constantly cleave to and find comfort in the midst of transitions. Any initial comments before we move on? Any thoughts about transitions? Challenges of transitions? Tell you, ones that are really tough are the ones you never expect. It's one thing to know you're about to go through a transition, but it's a completely another thing when you don't even expect a transition that you're going through. And so academically, maybe we might get ourselves in a little bit of a bubble here and say, well, this is somewhat of an easy challenge to tackle. But think about those transitions that you've either gone through or that you could go through in the future that you've never expected. I mentioned to you just a few minutes ago about prayer requests on my aunt's behalf. My Aunt Nancy is an absolute firecracker and is one of the members of our family who will show up to football games at the crack of dawn to support our family. and is always on the go and on the move, but has now broke her femur falling off a ladder in the hospital. Well, neither her family, or us would have ever expected something like that, right? You could think of situations you've been in your life, again, whether it be health, financial, circumstantial, that came and hit you like a Mack truck out of nowhere. That's tough. How do these get managed? These situations get managed faithfully. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Fixate on those things that will never change because of Him, and that you can maintain and not change because of what you can control. So 3 points that will never change because of Him. Point number 1, His wisdom. His wisdom. God's wisdom never changes. God's wisdom is eternal. Let's get a couple verses here. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 19. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 19. And let's also get some verses in Psalms. So I got 2 Psalm passages. Psalm 104 and verse 24. Psalm 104 and verse 24. And then Psalm 136 and verse 5. Psalm 136 and verse 5. If someone could get Proverbs 3 and verse 19 to start us off.
The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding He established the heavens.
Okay, so think about that here for a second. What was used to found the earth? God's wisdom. I mean, is there anything that we can cleave to that won't change? Wow. His wisdom founded the earth. Psalm 104 and verse 24. Uh, 104 and verse 24. And the next one is Psalm 136 and verse 5. 104, 24. That's all right.
O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions.
So the works of God, the stars above, the universe, the sun, the beauty of His creation. Wisdom. All right? Psalm 136 and verse 5. By wisdom, God made the heavens. What a blessing it is that we can rely on His mercy. Let's get another one here. Proverbs 21 and verse 30. Proverbs 21 and verse 30. If someone could read that for me. Proverbs 21 and verse 30.
There is no wisdom or understanding or counsel against the Lord.
So think about that. There is no wisdom that exists that goes against God. Just pause on that for a second. What does that tell us about wisdom? It's always going to be aligned with God. Wisdom will be aligned with eternality. Wisdom will be aligned with divinity. Folks, we can rely on His wisdom. Okay? Let's look at point number 2, His weights. Got a couple more verses here in Proverbs, so let's go through these. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 1, if someone can get that for me. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 1. And then Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 11. So Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 1, and then Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 11. Dishonest scales are an abomination unto Him, but a just weight is His delight. What is that saying? Talk about His wisdom. What can we rely on in transitions? What never moves? His wisdom, His weights. What are we talking about? His weights. Measures. And so, translated in our society, what would we consider when we think of that? Yep, exactly. So basically, and you're translating that into every context. Basically, any case where dishonesty is occurring, it isn't right. It's against the Lord. And so you think about transitions. Again, think about that circumstance. Think about that moment in time when you're now overwhelmed with the storms of life or with some type of uncertainty and difficulty. You're feeling a lack of comfort. You're struggling with what you used to know and you don't like the change. Are you a little bit more tempted maybe in cutting some corners in order to make things the way you want them to be again? Is the temptation a little bit higher to be dishonest? Temptation a little bit higher to maybe not be up and up on the way things accurately, truthfully are. Yeah, right. And that's what you should be contemplating. And it's interesting because talking about going to bed, I think it's very interesting. I've tried to wrap my mind around this for a while. If you look at Hebrews chapter 13, notice here verse 4, verse 5 together. These are back-to-back verses. Verse 4, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Okay? So that blessing of the marriage bond and the comfort and the joy and the peace that exists within that marriage bond and the ability to rest your head on your pillow at night in a sanctified fashion through the marriage relationship according to God's plan. And then you go on to verse 5. Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Just pause here for a second. So covetousness, what are you going to be running after? Well, you may be running after another man's wife, verse 4. That's a problem. What might else you be running after? Money, or a lifestyle, or an image, or possessions of this life. And why are you trying to cleave to those things? What are you looking for? Stability, comfort, surety. But what is God saying here at the end of verse 5? He's never going to leave you. He's never going to forsake you. Now, when Sharon described earlier, people don't like change, that's where the question of comfort comes in. Because grief is really the process of experiencing loss. And so when you're going through a transition, what are you losing? The way things used to be. Again, that could be anything. You're losing that context, that circumstance. And you don't like the fact that you're no longer in that situation. And so you're grieving. You're going through loss. Sometimes people only apply the word grief, and we've taught our children this as well. They've heard this many times. Sometimes people only apply the word grief and the understanding of grief in the context of death. Certainly it's applicable there. Grief is something we wrestle with all the time, which is why we want comfort. Because we experience loss. We experience changes. We experience transitions. And in the midst of those circumstances, we might struggle with wanting something different, but what does God say? I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. His wisdom is sure. His weight, his truth is sure. Let's get a couple of other verses out of Proverbs. Proverbs 16 in verse 11. Okay, so again, that which is just, as Linda described earlier, butcher putting his thumb on the scale. Why is he doing that? Trying to charge more money for the meat. But that which is just, that which is honest, belongs to the Lord. Proverbs 20 and verse 10, and then another one in Proverbs 20, verse 23. So Proverbs 20 and verse 10, Proverbs 20 and verse 23.
Diverse weights and diverse measures, they are both alike, an abomination to the Lord.
23. Very similar, I think.
Diverse weights are an abomination to the Lord, and dishonest scales are not good.
Okay, so
He's saying this at least 3 times.
Yeah, right. We've gotten 4 verses just out of Proverbs. Absolutely. And again, Proverbs being the book of wisdom. So you contemplate again your world, transitions, changes. Might be tempted to do things in a way that's dishonest. Might want to hold on to what you have, and because you don't want to lose it, maybe I can cut some corners, I can fudge this, I can alter that. This isn't exactly the way it should be. But what can we actually hold on to that will never change? What can we focus on that is eternal like he is? Truth. Truth will always be truth and will always belong to him, the Lord. Go ahead, brother. Yes.
So when standards are variable, it causes mistrust, causes distrust. One of the things about comfort is you don't accept comfort from someone you don't trust.
Yes.
So God, throughout Scripture, has proven that he is constant. He does not change. If God changed, as the world believes, changed from the Old Testament to the New Testament, he's vengeful God in the Old Testament, merciful God in the New Testament. If that were true, we couldn't trust him. He has shown himself trustworthy throughout the entirety of Scripture, which is why we can trust him, why we can trust that he will never leave us nor forsake us.
Absolutely.
Which is also one of my understanding of this. That's why it's such a funny
Yes.
when people lie
Yes.
and when people are changing weights, balances,
Right.
which part of what I do every single day at work deals with
That.
a scale that
Wow.
measures thousands upon thousands of pounds,
Mm-hmm.
which if that goes out of calibration, wreaks havoc, cause us to cheat someone or be cheated ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when part of why I believe God hates it so much is because it breaks the
Yes.
order.
Amen.
He set everything in order for purpose. And then when people lie or try to cheat with his lie,
Right.
they are trying to thwart the reality that he set and trying to break your trust.
Yes. Yes. It's the natural, to your point, standard as to how he created the world, that, the perfect world of accounting, debits equal the credits, and it all checks out. And when man comes in and starts trying to alter those things, yeah, man may get away with it for a little while, but he's now against and opposing God and the way things ought to be. And when we're going through these changes, we're going to walk the straight and narrow, as we say. We're going to cleave to that which is universally true, which includes exactly what you just described, Andrew, which is all rooted in, again, his truthful nature. Truth is truth and will always be truth. And folks, this is a complete new concept, especially to the young people of this world, where we live in a postmodern society where everybody gets their own truth. And that's what our young people are being taught. You get your truth, and I get my truth, and our truth's completely different, but that's okay. That's not okay. That's not logical. It doesn't yield comfort, to Andrew's point. I'm now confused. And it causes me heartache and difficulty, okay? And let's look at a couple of other verses here. Psalm 19 and verse 9. Psalm 19 and verse 9. If someone go ahead and get for me Psalm 119 and 160. Psalm 119 and 160. Then if someone else can get for me Psalm 146, verses 5 and 6. Psalm 146, verses 5 and 6. I'll get Psalm 19 and verse 9 to begin. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And so again, fearing God, his judgments, his truth, his judgments are true, his judgments are righteous. It's everlasting. It's stable. All right? Psalm 119, 160, if someone could read that for me.
Thy word is true. Every one of thy righteous judgments endures forever.
Okay, so it will endure forever. Forever. Cleave to that. All right, I think we had someone getting ready to read Psalm 146, verses 5 and 6. Psalm 146, verses 5 and 6.
Happy is he that hath God Jacob for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God, which made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that therein is, which keeps truth forever.
Okay, so in the time when you are in need of help, you will be happy if you are relying on God. Why? Because it's eternal here. That's what we're talking about. Absolute truth. What a blessing that is. So what are we going to cleave to in the midst of transitions? What never changes? His wisdom, his weights. Point number 3, his wife. His wife never changes. Okay? His eternal kingdom built on his eternal standard. His wife, in reference there, of course, to the church. Revelation 22 and verse 17, and the Spirit and the bride say, come, and let him who hears say, come, and let him who thirsts come. Whoever desires, let him take the water of life freely. If someone could read for me Ephesians 5, 24 through 27. Ephesians chapter 5, 24 through 27. And again, I want you to think of this as we just read a few minutes ago, Hebrews chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Verse 5 then tells us, do not have a life where we are conducting based upon covetousness, but be content with such things as we have, for he has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Again, that context of what we described earlier and the comfort and the blessings of the marriage bond and relationship. And here, God now is describing the church as his wife. Revelation 22, verse 17 that we just read. And if someone could read for me, Ephesians 5, 24 through 27.
Therefore, this church testifies that the wives keep their husbands. Husbands love their wives, just like Christ gave himself for her. He might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water, that he might present her to himself, glorious having spot or wrinkle, or any such thing, that which he should be holy without blemish.
Thank you, brother, so much. The Proverbs writer tells us that the husband should always be satisfied with his wife. And here we find that the church is the wife of Christ, the bride of God, and is presented without blemish. Perfection. Perfection. God's kingdom, the church, is eternal. The church and the kingdom are one. If we notice, for example, what Paul will write to the Colossians in Colossians chapter 1, he states there, starting in verse 13, he has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. And so when we are added to the church by obeying the gospel, just as Will taught this evening, we then are a part of the kingdom. We're translated, we're transferred into the kingdom. We now belong to God. We're a part of that body. And that body is eternal. If someone could read for me 2 Samuel 7 and verse 13. 2 Samuel 7 and verse 13. If someone else can get for me Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44. Let's start off with 2 Samuel 7 and verse 13. Okay, so, hey, is the United States of America, how it was founded, still going to exist 50 years from now? Folks, I have no idea. I know that I fret about that all the time. Aggressively. To the point where I try to avoid conversations almost and even talking about it because it concerns me so much. But guess what? Church. The Lord's kingdom. Eternal. Let's look at Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44. If someone could read that one for me. Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. Okay, so never be destroyed. Made up of all the kingdoms of the world. Isn't that what the globalists want? Don't they want that? Don't they want some kind of claim to be able to say, hey, we are so diverse and we have people from everywhere and we have all this unity because of our diversity? I mean, you can't beat God. God's already come up with that plan and it's already here. It's in the Church of Christ. And what a blessing that is. It will never be destroyed. Wow. Wow. Sometimes I think regarding the transitions of life, what can I tell young people? What can I tell our children? What can I tell folks that haven't gone through certain transitions yet so that they might just hold on to just those couple of words? Maybe there's a sermon that I can give them. If you just listen to this sermon, you can prepare for the hardness and the difficulties of life. Maybe there's some kind of tip. Maybe there's some kind of saying or quip that I can provide them, or maybe a book or something, so that they can rely on that no matter what they face, so that they can focus on that beautiful source to refresh them when they're at that crossroads wondering what to do. Isn't there just something I can just say? And you know what the answer is? No. Because it's not a saying. And it's not just one sermon. Hannah and I have said so many times this year, because of the study that we're going through together as a congregation, man, I can use that every week. We've said it so many times, I think we've just stopped saying it because we've started realizing we need it all every week. And that's the church. And the church is not just a saying. The church is not just a tip. The church is not just a book. It's built and living in the book. But the church provides comfort, certainty, reliability, surety, beauty, refreshment throughout all the challenges of life. Folks, you can't just say the church. You have to be the church and live in the church and for the church to know that. Not just a saying, it's a lifestyle. Go ahead, brother. Yes.
Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Belief itself is built on trust.
Yes.
So the church has to be rooted and grounded in truth.
Amen.
You can't just walk off and make rules however you want.
Yes. Yes. Amen.
One little tip thing, however you want to say it, most is
Yeah.
but the whole point of trust.
Yes. Right.
The whole scripture is put there so that we can trust.
Yes.
So that we can believe that what said in scripture is true.
Right. Amen. 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 And to your point earlier about congregations that cease from trusting in the Lord and teaching the truth, again, Revelation tells us the Lord will remove the candlestick. I mean, just because it has a name and just because it says it's church or even a name associated with God's people does not mean in any way that it is God's people. And it is a blessing to, again, have the comfort in what you're describing, Andrew, is it's not just a place and it's not just a group of people, but it is both. It is God's people living in this and for this. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. 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 I've heard someone say before, the key is really, and it's right along the lines of those words, is perseverance. I mean, if you learn that you just have to keep going and you're focusing on this, right, and that's the point, is it's a life in the church. And what a blessing, again, that is through all the transitions of life. What about what we can control? So we now know what never changes, what he has provided. His wisdom, his weights, his wife. What can we control? In those times, we get frazzled sometimes because we think, again, we're going through grief. We don't want to lose what we had. We're struggling. And so we just constantly maybe think about what it is I've lost. And we're not really focusing in on what it is we can control. What can we control? Well, your work. Your work. You can control your work. Look at Proverbs 10 and verse 16. If someone can read for me Proverbs 10 and verse 16. If someone else can read for me Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 13. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 13. And if someone else could get for me out of Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 13, and then 26 and verse 13. So both verse 13, chapter 22, and chapter 26. So start off Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 16. If someone could read that for me. Okay, so the labor of the righteous leads to life. There is life in laboring righteously. And again, we're in a society now where like work is a bad thing. Like work is a taboo. It's something you should avoid and stay away from. It's like, no, I don't want, wait a second. Labor is a good thing. All right, let's look at Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 13. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 13. And just as a reminder, it's Proverbs 22 and verse 13 and Proverbs 26 and verse 13. 3:13. Mm-hmm.
And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God.
Okay, so to earn a wage, to earn provisions, to earn a living based on work is a gift from God. Folks, that's a news flash to a lot of people. It is a blessing to be able to work. I've heard of situations, I think it was Harry Truman, I believe, who went through a lot of tragedy in his life, and in no way am I saying he's the model father or figure at all, but he was president of the United States and was a pretty diligent person in terms of trying to aid his fellow man. And when he would go through tragedy, he would actually intensify his work multifold. Because, and he would write, it helped him cope with the difficulties that he was trying to deal with. Let's look at Proverbs chapter 22, verse 13, and then Proverbs 26 and verse 13. All right, and then 26 and verse 13. Emphasis here, very similar. Okay, so what's the point? Not going to work. One excuse is just as good as another. Not going to work. problematic. You can control your work. And again, I think the big takeaway here is when you're going through that moment of grief and transition and difficulty, what do you want to do? I mean, I've been there. You want to sleep. You want to hide. You want to avoid everyone. But wait, what if you dove yourself into work? You can control your work. You can control your words. You can control what you say. Challenging, but you can. James chapter 3. And then finally, you can control your worship. You can control your worship. When transitions occur, what a blessing to always be able to come back to the old paths. To be able to worship God off that good doctrine according to his will. It's exactly what Paul and Silas did, right, when they were in jail. Acts chapter 16, verses 24 through 25. James says, if any of you are married, let him sing. If any of you suffers, let him pray. James chapter 5, verse 13. And so worship, whether we're suffering, whether we're in the midst of joy, going to God and worship allows us to keep that stability and maintain course. Any final comments here? Go ahead, brother.
For those of us who are control enthusiasts, we like to control a little bit of bitter pills follow sometimes. We are focused on control, which ultimately is nothing more than itself.
Right.
And it's also a little bit ironic when viewed in this light. Work with your pastor, New Testament, is to work on ourselves so that we work for other people.
Right. Amen, brother. Amen. It's one of the biggest challenges we face. And like you said, and it is, I think as Christians, we want to influence and we want to be wise and we want to make sure that we facilitate an environment that is healthy, spiritually and for those around us. But if we're not careful, we can become so focused and distracted on that we forget actually what we're supposed to be doing, which is working on ourselves